What's up, vintage lovers? Welcome to the Vintage Aquarium. I'm your host, Kate, a writer and storyteller with a passion for all things vintage. Each week, I'll talk with other sellers and collectors about their vintage passions too. We'll share tips and resources, and together, discover the stories and history behind our favorite items. It's time, so let's dive in. Welcome to the first episode of the Vintage Aquarium podcast. I'm Kate, your host, and I'm excited to introduce my first guest, Caroline Wilder. She's a Gen Xer like me, wife, mom, and the owner of Phineas Street Vintage, where she's on a mission to save the planet by encouraging others to buy secondhand and pre-loved items. Her mission and hashtag is Buy Vintage, Save the World, and she walks the talk, selling her carefully curated vintage decor in her store on Etsy and at several in-person New England area pop-up shops throughout the year. Caroline is also the founder of the Phineas Street School, where she blends her passion for vintage with her many years of experience in the corporate world to coach other vintage Etsy entrepreneurs. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you, Kate. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm really glad to have you. This is so exciting.
I know. In your first podcast. So
yeah.
I have a ton of questions for you too, just so you know.
I couldn't think of a better person to have on as a guest for the first podcast. My goal for this podcast is to take a deep dive into all things vintage and to tell the stories behind the buyers, sellers, and collectors, and to share knowledge about the vintage items that we love so much. So I was really hoping that maybe we could start by sharing a little bit about how we both became involved in the vintage world. And I would love to hear more about your story.
Okay. Man, I feel like it's just evolved so much. And I know yours has too, where it kind of started as a hobby and then turned into a more serious business. And now I've, hatched like another business, which is my Phineas Street School on top of that. So it has been like kind of a huge evolution over the years. So I got started in 2015 when I was living in Boston. There was a vintage market right down the street, and I decided to get a booth at that vintage market. It was only open on Sundays, so I would set up every Sunday there, and then I opened up an Etsy shop in parallel to that to kind of supplement, because of course, once you start buying vintage, there's like no stopping you, and next thing you know, you've got piles of it. So I started selling in person and online, kind of as like more of like a creative outlet to supplement the corporate gig that I was doing. I was newly married, didn't have any kids yet, and it was just something I was always passionate about. I feel like growing up with my older relatives of like the greatest generation, there was so much like mid-century and cool vintage in their homes, and I was always like so intrigued by it. My mother also is, our entire house is basically filled with antiques, and my uncle's an interior designer. So I feel like it's kind of in my blood. And we've always been like, bargain hunters as well. So, that's kind of how I got started. And then it really evolved over the years into a more serious thing after I had my son, where it just, it's just kind of took over. Like I was just so passionate about vintage. I couldn't stop. So almost a year and a half ago, I left my corporate job to pursue vintage and my coaching business, where I help empower fellow, mostly Etsy vintage sellers to live out their passions, just like I'm doing as well. So that's kind of my background in a nutshell. I don't know. It can be a kind of a long-winded story, but I'm going to stop there. And I want to know about you. How you got started and how you got here, because it's just super interesting that your passion evolved into a podcast.
Yeah, so we kind of started right about the same time. I was in the like corporate world too. I owned my own publishing company, and so I actually we went through the recession, things were tough. I ended up selling my my magazine publishing company, and then I was diagnosed with breast cancer. Really, actually the same week that I signed on the dotted line, I found out I had breast cancer. So I started going through treatment, and I was tired and kind of bored. I didn't really have anything going on at that point because I didn't have my company anymore. I was trying to sort of reinvent my life. And then my grandfather passed away. And so my uncle had offered us the opportunity to go see if there was anything at the house that we wanted. And it was so weird because I, interesting, like, didn't grow up with in a family that like vintage, things. They didn't, my mom loved new things. Everything was, like she curated at the, store. And so I wasn't surrounded by that stuff, but I was always a creative person. So I like the idea of pulling different things together. And even at the magazine, we would style our photo shoots using vintage stuff. So I would like go to the thrift store and like try to find dishes for a food photo shoot, or we would get clothing and stuff for people to wear in fashion shoots. So that kind of stuff I had done a little bit of, but when I walked into my grandparents' house, I had this like complete feeling of nostalgia. Like, oh my gosh, these were the things of my childhood. There were so many beautiful things that my grandmother had left that were probably her mother's or her grandmother's. And these were things I had never seen before. And so I was really excited to kind of go through all of that and be able to, like, luckily we were able to take a few things home. And there were a few mid-century things. There were some things from the Depression. There were some things earlier than that. And I think at that time, and I'm interested to know if you experienced this, like that generation saved everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you see that in your household growing up, or like with your family?
Yeah. I mean, my mother, a lot of things got stored away in the attic, which unfortunately, I think a lot of them have gotten purged at this point, because I would die to go up there and find all my old clothing from the 80s. And I think a lot of it's gone, and I'm like so upset about it. But yeah, I mean, I used to just spend hours in like my great auntie's, which is so anyway, Phineas Street, just to get into that. Phineas Street, the name was the street that my three great aunties, which were kind of like my three grandmothers or yayas, my Greek grandmothers, lived in this farmhouse, and that's the street that they lived on. So that's why I named it Phineas Street. So I would spend like hours. They had this library upstairs, and I just would spend hours up there kind of digging around because there was so much cool stuff in it, including almanacs. Like, and I actually took their almanac collection. That was one of the things that I took from their house, because they had like, almanacs going back to like the 30s. So I used to just like kind of flip through all that stuff. I was sort of fascinated with all the old things that they had. But yeah.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that's so cool that you had that experience. That's kind of how I felt at my grandmother's house. And interestingly, I guess since they had lived through the Depression, or at least had been influenced by that, by their parents, she saved all kinds of stuff like tin pie tins, pie tin, pie tin, pie plates, and like every Christmas decoration ever and things like that. So there was a lot of stuff that wasn't, usable or useful, but she had all the glassware, and they fished and went out on the boat. And so there was tons of stuff like that. My grandfather was a surveyor. And so there were lots of old like thermoses and coolers and fishing gear. And he also manufactured a lot of things. Like he manufactured all of the equipment and boxes and stuff that they took out on surveying. So they purchased a certain amount of things, but then everything else, like he would machine screws and nails and
Wow.
Yeah, he was very frugal. And also I think it was a creative outlet for him. Like I think he just really enjoyed building things. A lot of their built-ins and furniture and stuff was all made by my grandfather. So that was kind of neat to see. Yeah. So we got a little bit of furniture, and then a lot of some industrial things, and a lot of collectibles and stuff. So for me, that was sort of like my first look at that world, like from a larger perspective. And so then I was so interested in it. My fiance said, well, we should go to the auction. And I was like, what's that? I've never been to an auction. Have you been to any of do you have auctions in your
have. Yeah, like I have up in Maine, and it's wild. It's hilarious. It's like
Yeah.
a tiny little one, and it's just so funny. Everyone has assigned seats, and there's a little snack bar with hot dogs and some treats, and it's really fun. Really fun.
It's the same in Maryland. So that's where I'm in Western Maryland. And they give you a little number when you go in. Of course, you sign up for your number, and it's kind of intimidating at first.
Oh, it's so scary. Yeah. Yeah.
You're afraid you're gonna mess up. And I did get the like finger,
Oh
wag yeah,
no.
once or twice. Um, but yeah, you go in there and so, but I kind of got bit by that bug. Like it was so exciting to just sit there and to see, what people are bidding on, and to see that sometimes there are things that are just really neat and they don't go for very much money, like somebody's not
Yeah.
interested in them, whatever. So after that, I was like, okay, I'm hooked and I can do this, because so it was kind of a thing for me. Like it took me a year to go through treatments for cancer. And so on my, good days, I would kind of go out to the auction. I'd maybe pick up a few things. It made me sort of feel empowered. Like I could carry these boxes of stuff
Right.
back to my car and I could sort it and clean it and get it all ready. And so I decided to open up a booth at one of the antique malls in the area. And so that's kind of how I started. So that was 2015, 2016. Yeah, right about the same time that you
Right.
started.
Yeah. So you started in person too.
Mm. Yep. Yep.
When did you start selling online?
So I'm trying to think, probably not too long after that, I started to get really interested in like lace and vintage craft supplies, ribbon and stuff like that. I bid on an auction and I got this huge lot of like beautiful embroidered ribbon. And I started looking it up, looking around, and I realized that it was kind of rare. Like you can't get it too often anymore, French ribbon and things like that. Because it's sort of an art that doesn't exist so much anymore. I got some gorgeous lace from New York, like that had been from, I guess, I don't know, I'd say maybe the 50s. And some of it had been handmade and things like that. And so I sort of got into that. And so my first shop that I opened was called, well, I still have that shop. It's called She's So Vintage, like SEW
I
Vintage.
love that name. I love it.
And so I was like, I'm gonna, list this ribbon, list some of the lace and things like that. And then I started to get involved in Facebook groups that specialized in that because I realized like I don't know anything about this. I don't know enough about it. So I think really that's where my like first like foray into learning in depth about items, because everybody sort of researches them to list, you want to do your comps and stuff to list your stuff, but I really got excited about learning about the history, about how things were made, where they came from, how they were used. And people collect ribbon, they collect lace, they study it to see how it was made. And then vintage buttons are like another really big thing in vintage fabrics. And so I started to learn all about this stuff. And I was like, wow, this is so cool that people like admire and appreciate these things that were made, you know, before I was born, and the quality that was put into that stuff. So much of it was made in the USA at the time. And I just really loved it. I mean, I kind of think about it like in the 80s is sort of when China really started to come in, and well, we started to import a lot of things from China. And I think that's when the big shift happened from handmade stuff to imported items.
Right. And you're still selling those.
Yep. So I still have She's So Vintage. I've expanded it a little bit to include like more craft materials. So one of the things I love to find, like source and sell, are kits and books. So like a kit would be like a latch hook kit or an embroidery kit that has your instructions. It has all of the materials that you need, the thread and the yarn and the tools. And so you just sort of like buy it in one thing. And you don't get those so much anymore. Although I have to say that there are some really great sellers on Etsy that are creating new designs and they're selling their items as kits. That's really cool to see. And then the other thing I really like to get source are vintage craft books. So a lot of the old patterns you can get, like embroidery patterns. I just sold yesterday, actually, I sold a Japanese pattern book, which I thought was really neat, like Japanese techniques in embroidery, and it has a bunch of patterns and things. So I think that there's so much out there that sometimes that knowledge gets a little bit lost. It's in these books that are out of print. And so I really enjoy like selling those.
Yeah. And I think too, like during the pandemic, a lot of that, the DIY craft stuff really took off because people were looking for a creative outlet. So,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
you think it's like really continued. I think it has. I think people really like to make things themselves. But I feel like it wasn't like that for a while. Like, and it's just like, having a new moment.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that crafting is one of those things that you can do, and it's almost like meditating in a
Yeah.
way where you're in your head, you have that quiet space, you're calm, you're just, focused on what it is that you're doing. I think maybe that's partially why it's become so much more popular. People they weren't running around with all those activities during the pandemic, and then they realized how enjoyable that was, and then continued with that, because I definitely think craft supplies have boomed since that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. And that's a big category on Etsy too. Like
Yeah,
selling supplies on Etsy is huge.
yeah, yeah, I think that's one of the top.
Yeah.
um it is, well, the top sellers on Etsy are craft supply,
Craft. Yep.
mostly beading,
Yeah.
which I
They
enjoy.
sell a lot of it. Yeah. Crystals are big too. I think like the
Mhm.
crystals are a big category too.
So tell me about how your Etsy shop has evolved over time.
Okay. So when I first started, I really didn't know what I was doing. I kind of just jumped into it. I I started buying like anything that was vintage that I thought somebody would like, which
As
was
most of us do.
yeah, and it was like a lot of milk glass. I was really into like that cut glass. I still love it, but I was realizing, I was selling in person at the time at this like kind of big time vintage market in Boston, and I just I just didn't know enough back then. Like, when you first start something, you just don't know what I didn't really even know what to look for. I was just kind of buying things that I liked. So I definitely made a lot of mistakes like back then where I bought a lot of things that like people just didn't end up buying. So um that kind of evolved. I started, I was living in Boston at the time, and I started, decorating my condo, and then I moved out to the burbs. So I started really buying more things that like I had more space when I moved out to, um, into a house. So I started really like going all in on buying things that like I would use to decorate my own home. So I don't know if I told you what I sold, but I sell mostly like housewares.
Okay.
So I do, mostly small housewares. And then I do a little jewelry, some hats, like some, women's accessories and stuff. But back when I was actually first started, I did a little bit of furniture. So I was selling furniture because I had an in-person space where I could actually store the furniture. But then, as the years went on, I had my son in 2016. I sort of took a little bit of a break and then went back to it. And I realized, and I was also working full time. So I was like, I don't really have time to do like big stuff. I just didn't have time to source it. I didn't have time to deal with selling it. So I really got into smalls. So the smaller the thing, the better. I love just small things because they're easy to store, they're easy to ship, like pack and ship. They're usually, more inexpensive to ship. Um, I just really enjoy like finding small things. They just take so much less time. So I'm all about volume. I just want to like get that volume out there. Um, yeah, and then I mean the selling thing, it kind of evolved into coaching. So I was realizing that all I wanted to do was spend, basically 24 hours a day talking about vintage with other people. And I was just, when the pandemic hit in 2020, we were all DMing. It was like everyone was on Instagram DMing. And I was finding that I was spending a lot of my time helping other sellers with like technical issues on Etsy or strategy, or people would be like, Caroline, would you do it this way or that way? And I was realizing I like really had a passion for helping others. So that's kind of how my coaching business evolved. So I've been, I probably spend like half of my time coaching, half of my time selling at this point.
Okay. So I
So
want to get back to the coaching thing. because I have a lot more questions for
Yeah.
you about that. So give a couple examples of some things that you like to sell that are, because you were saying about how they're, smalls that are maybe
Right.
home decor that are easy to pack. Like what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite things to sell are like small items that are not breakable because I also have this, my whole buy or sell vintage save the world mission where I don't really like to use bubble wrap and, packing materials that can't be like reused or recycled.
Okay.
So I anything that's like small, unbreakable takes, just a couple minutes to pack is my thing. I mean, obviously I like to go find interesting, different objects, but like lately as I've gotten busier and, during my corporate job, like I just didn't, you just don't have a lot of time. So it's like the time to research new items is just, you can go down a rabbit hole and spend an hour researching an item and then you're only charging 40, $50. And then it's like, it's not, totally worth your time at that point. So now, I've sold thousands of items, right? In person on Etsy. At this point, I really like enjoy finding things I've sold previously. I know that sounds kind of boring, but it's just a lot easier for me. I mean, I'm running a business, so I want to maximize like, I want to maximize my profits. And for me to go out, I get really, really excited when I find like things that I've already sold before, just so it's a quick, easy list and I know it's proven to sell. So I can just pop it in my shop and usually it sells.
Well, I
So
think that's a great tip.
yeah,
That's a great tip for people who are trying to get their volume up, is to take a look at sourcing things that you've already sold. So you can just, and on Etsy, you can just duplicate an older listing, right?
right.
Something that's sold, and then update that listing with any new details and if
Yep.
there are any, and then just
Yeah.
relist it. Yeah,
Yeah,
that
totally.
cuts down a lot of time.
Yeah, and I know, like, I don't sell on eBay, but my husband does a little eBay, but I wish we had this well, actually, I don't know if I wish we had it on Etsy, but you can just, like, copy someone else's listing. It's like, you can just I don't know. Do you sell on eBay? I can't remember if you sell on eBay or not.
Yeah, I do still
A little
sell
bit?
on eBay a little bit.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. So you can just go into someone else's listing and be like, "Have one like this," and then it just copies their listing. I'm like, "Oh my god,
That's
how
so
easy
nice.
is that?" I'm like, "That's cheating. That's cheating."
I know, too
Um,
bad Etsy doesn't have that. But yeah, I mean,
I
eBay
know.
gives you so many options too, as far as like little tiny details and stuff. And it just totally adds all that information in there for you. Yeah. All right. So for me, it's interesting because our paths started out in a similar way, but we sort of diverged,
Yeah.
into different things. I mean, for me, selling in person hasn't been very successful, or at least at the time when I did it, I was really not very successful at it. I mean, I was maybe breaking even. I had all this stuff. I don't know. Part of it, I
Oh,
think,
by the way, I
yeah,
wasn't successful either. I just want you to know. I was not successful. I don't even know if I was making my rent when I was selling.
yeah, that's kind of how I was feeling.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, do you think I mean, it seems like now vintage is so much more popular, even than it was like in,
Yeah.
2016, 2017. Like, I here's a good example. Okay. I had these canisters, these mushroom canisters. I had them marked for like $18 and didn't sell them. And so I think I packed them away. They've been in a box forever. I pulled them out during the pandemic, and I was like, oh, I have these, are huge. I should try to sell them and get them
Yeah,
out of
that's
my
my biggest nightmare, just so you know, like packing a set of canisters is like
canisters.
my
Oh,
nightmare.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're a lot of work. Like, great, I'll do this anyway. I mean, they sold like that. They
Yeah.
sold like that for really good money. I mean, I was like, because when I pulled them out, I still had the old tags on them or whatever. And I'm like, this is unbelievable. I couldn't sell them at the shop for $18. And here, so I think the popularity of a lot of this stuff has really gone up over time. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, and I mean, it also depends well, first of all, mushrooms are so big. So, like, people just love mushrooms and owls, stuff like that. All that woodland stuff, like the woodland creature things, I think got really popular, especially during the pandemic, because I just noticed that was just, on my Instagram everywhere, it was just selling like crazy. Yeah, so I think it also depends. I mean, you're in Maryland, right? In the kind of a rural area. I mean, I think it also depends on, like, the shopper, right? I think you can there's certain things that, sell better online. Like, you've got a worldwide audience when you're selling those mushroom canisters, not just a bunch of people that are popping into an antique mall. So that's one of the reasons why, I mean, I love selling on a platform like Etsy, where I've got people worldwide looking for the specific things that I'm trying to sell. And I just, you can charge more, you have a bigger audience. And I find, like, just with, especially with like the sellers I work with and just friends that sell in, antique malls or in person, usually they're charging a little bit less, depending on the location. Like, if you're selling, I don't know, if you're selling at like I don't know, the Chelsea flea market. If you're in like New York or something, maybe, you could probably charge more than you sell online. But in certain parts of the country, you can't charge those prices. Like, people just aren't going to buy them. And I think when people are stopping into places like antique malls, they're looking for a bargain. Like, they're kind of bargain hunting, whereas
Yeah.
online, it's more like a curated shopping experience. Like, I look at Etsy as kind of like a boutique shopping experience where you're going in and, you're buying a quality item from like a boutique seller.
I
That's
think
how,
that's a great point. Yeah,
yeah,
because if you're in an antique mall too, you're sort of sourcing from the same area that you're selling. And so a lot of the stuff that you're sourcing is available to other people if they're interested in sourcing. And whereas in, some of the other areas, I think that sourcing isn't so prevalent. Like, it's not like California and New York, maybe it's not so easy to source.
right.
As it is in an area, like ours, possibly. So that's a really good point. So I really ended up abandoning my my shop, and
How
I
long were you there?
uh,
Like, how long did you try it for?
I did it for probably 2 years, and
Oh,
not just
wow.
that shop. I tried like 3 different locations. And I never could quite figure out the recipe for success. And even though I did better, I still was like, I don't know, I wasn't loving tagging things and moving inventory around and stuff like that. Like, I just didn't feel like I had the bandwidth to be stocking my shop every week. And then I was disappointed if things didn't sell. So I just, I finally just kind of was like, I like the online experience because I can, um, I can, I can do the research in my own time. I feel like I'm getting better, return for my time investment and all that stuff. And by that time too, I had also taken a full-time job. So I was working, even though I was working from home, I was working a full-time job. And so I just didn't really have the ability to, I don't know, put the effort into the shops. And then interestingly, like a lot of the little antique malls around here have closed as well. So
Wow.
yep. Now this was before the pandemic. So a lot of them closed. And then once sort of like around the same time when the pandemic hit, I left my job that I had. And so I was really able to kind of put more time into online selling. And I had all of this inventory that had been sitting around.
Don't we all?
Right. I know. That's like it's like the other side of the double-edged sword, right? Where you
Yeah.
have all this inventory sitting around. And so I mean, luckily when people couldn't source, and you
Yeah.
and I, we had it. And like interestingly, I had tons of vintage fabric that I had been stockpiling. So when no one could get fabric, I had fabric. So I was selling fabric, I was making masks, and I started making masks. This is a little bit of an aside, but I started making face masks for the hospital and for hospice. And there was another woman who was donating face masks to a Native American community. And so I was like, oh, this is something that I can do because I have a sewing machine. I have lots of fabric. I was really hard to source elastic at the time. And so
I
I
remember
was,
that. Yeah.
yep,
Remember
that was my,
donating, like, I had a whole thing of elastic that I just happened to have, and I, like, remember dropping it off at someone's house so they could make masks. That was so wild that
yep.
there weren't any masks back then.
It was really wild. And I was, yeah, piecing things together. We were using
Yeah.
string and stuff like that. And I remember I was hammering out like a tin, like aluminum pans so that I could cut them up and make nose pieces so that I could put them inside of yeah, it was crazy. And I mean, that went on for like maybe a month or 2 months before we were able to actually get, start getting supplies again. But yeah, I made over 1,000 face masks
Oh
during
my
that
God,
time.
Kate.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
it was
I bet
crazy,
they were
right?
I bet they were gorgeous too, because you're Halloween.
I know I got
So
really
that
good at
way.
it, right? after making so many. Yep, I got really good at it. They were fun. So so that actually sort of sustained me too, financially after a while, you know, for during the pandemic and stuff. And I know I got off track here down like a rabbit hole, but you know, that was sort of one of the neat things too about that time, is that everybody was sort of taking a look at themselves and
Yeah.
like where their skills were, what they're able to do. Like me, you know, I did that as well. And so I think that selling vintage and my love of vintage and the stories really started to come to the forefront for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, over all of the other things that I was doing in my life. And so, you know, I had gone through this big like creative roller coaster where I was like, I owned a magazine, I was creating every day, to kind of just like, you know, going through cancer treatment and then getting through, you know, working this more corporate job that I had and marketing. And so, you know, finally we were all kind of had this time to be like quiet with ourselves
Right.
and think about what we were doing with our, you know, our lives. And so for me, I thought, you know what? I just love telling stories. I love it. I love learning about people. I like learning about these objects, these vintage objects that I'm finding and the stories behind them. And I started to do some writing on Medium at that point in time. Like I was taking a bunch of writing classes. I joined this writing mastermind group, and I thought, you know what, I'm really going to just start honing my storytelling skills. That's what I wanted to do. And so I did a lot of writing. I started picking up some freelance writing jobs. And then I realized, you know what, I just want to go back to like writing what I want to write about. I want to tell these stories. And so that was kind of like, after a lot of soul searching, where the idea for the Vintage Aquarium podcast came from. And then the plan is to have a companion website that goes along with it, so that there'll be resources, information, and in-depth stories that people can access and use to learn more about the items that you know, that I love, that you love, that we love, that people collect. And so my concept behind it, like my idea, is that I want to be able to look at the artisans and the people who created a lot of the vintage items, like, and the stories behind them. So like some good, you know, sort of, I don't know, examples of that maybe would be like certain periods of time, certain things were really booming, like certain styles, certain materials being used to create things. And so like when I look at vintage, I'm interested to know what you think about this. Like for me, it's sort of is like 80s maybe is like the end of it for me, because that's the end of the era when things were made by hand or made in the USA by artisans. And I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe like the late 1800s. I'm kind of interested in that Victorian era. But when I look at vintage, I mean, that's when you start to get into antique, right? I mean, what do you consider to be vintage?
I mean, I consider I say like up to the year 2000. Like I obviously consider 90s. I know that like on Etsy, the definition is 20 years, which freaks me out because they're already into like the year 2003. I'm
Right?
like, what's going to happen when we get to like present day? I'm like, there's so much crap out there. I'm like, is all this Target stuff going to be like Target brand going to be vintage? Like,
Considered
where do you
vintage.
draw the line, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, I know. I'm seeing some IKEA stuff come up as
Yeah.
vintage and things
Well,
like
there
that.
is some cool IKEA, I mean, cool
Mhm.
vintage IKEA stuff. So, but yeah, it's like, how do you know? And then it's like, how do you know? Right? Like there's certain things like if it's marked, I mean, even stuff that says made in China, that can be that's vintage, but it can be difficult to tell. So I am a little nervous for like what that's going to look like in a couple of years for sure. But yeah, I go up to like about 2000. You know, if I have a book that's published in 2002, I'll list it.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah, because I do have books that I've
Mhm.
listed, you know, craft books and things like that that I would consider to be vintage. You know, I think that a lot of it's in the eye of the curator, the person who's putting that style together. And that's one of the things that I think is really interesting about the opportunities with this podcast, is to talk about the different points of view and the different perspectives that people have on what vintage is and what they collect and what they're interested in collecting or sourcing. So like a great example is jewelry. Over time, jewelry's been influenced by different countries, different movements. The wars have really affected the availability of materials. So that affected what jewelry was made out of. Celebrities have really, we think of celebrities, what we have now, but I mean, Queen Victoria was a celebrity during the Victorian era. So that really affected what types of jewelry people were wearing, what was in style, things like that, influencers. And so I think that there are so many stories like that about families that started businesses that evolved into some of the great brands, the great names that we know today. I mean, whether that was in the United States or it was overseas. I mean, look at Cartier, look at, I have a good story about Steiff, which is a German stuffed animal. They made the original teddy bear, things like that. So those are all family businesses where one person's imagination, their spark of creativity, started basically like a legend, and that's been collected for many, many years. So those are some of the things that I'm interested in really talking about and exploring with the Vintage Aquarium podcast. And I know probably everybody's wondering what that means.
I love it because for me personally, like my history is not my strong suit, even though my dad was a history teacher. Like I'm more of like a technical math type analytical person. So it's hard for me to retain a lot of that. I'll read it, but it doesn't like sink into my brain. So I need all of this education as much as I can, especially when it comes to the vintage items I'm sourcing. And I've only lived, I was born in the late 70s, aging myself, but I lived through like the 80s and 90s. So I can easily spot like that era, I'm pretty good at that. But then when it comes to older stuff, like I really have to research. So if I can have more information like this, like, and I like to, consuming podcasts is like one of my favorite ways to learn. So I'm just psyched that you're doing this, because then I can I need every excuse right now to go out for a walk. So like for me, like, any kind of audiobook, podcast, I love listening to all that stuff when I'm out for a walk or driving or multitasking, packing orders. So like, this is exactly the type of information that like I want to, take in while I'm doing those things. So I'm thanking you in advance for all of the things I'm going to learn with this podcast.
Awesome. Well, I hope so. And I think that when you I think podcast is such a great medium for telling stories. And yeah, I mean, I'm the same way. Like I enjoy learning about things, but I was never one to, love history in school or anything like that. And, we're about the same age. So yeah, I mean, we get what we lived through. We understand all of that stuff, but anything prior to that, like, needs to have some kind of association. Like I need to understand why were things made from that material during that period of time? Okay, now whenever I'm out there and I see that, I'm like, oh, I totally remember. Now I can identify what that is. And I think that helps people source as well, because like it's so nice to have a starting point for you to be able to research something or look something up and to just be like, oh, that's definitely 1970s. Or, I'm going to say that that's from the 1940s, like that pair of shoes has that style or something like that. So I think that really helps.
Yeah.
So we have a few fun Q&As for the both of us. But before we get into those, I'd like to learn more about Phineas Street School, the community that you put together for Etsy vintage sellers.
Okay. So the way it really started was back in 2020, and I kind of talked about this a little earlier, where a lot of us were just DMing on Instagram and kind of communicating, and nobody was really talking face to face. Like I'd be talking to somebody here and talking to somebody there. And then I started actually, there was a program called Etsy University, or Etsy U, where Etsy was recruiting sellers from the platform to then go, coach workshops and like educate the masses. So I kind of jumped on that opportunity, as scary as it was, but I felt like, I have this whole background in business. I was in consulting. I'm like, I'm used to doing PowerPoint presentations. Like, I'm going to do it. I just thought it would be a great way for me to like learn from Etsy themselves. Like I actually got to take like a curriculum from Etsy, and they taught me and gave me like PowerPoint decks to kind of start with, so I could then go and host these webinars. So I did that a couple times in 2020. And then I realized that the biggest, like, what would you call it? Benefit to getting on these Zoom calls. I was supposed to be hosting an hour-long webinar. They'd go 2 hours because at the end, we were all just chatting about vintage and just about selling. And everyone had a million questions because we're like, nobody had ever been on Zoom looking at each other face to face before. And it was like all these people from the community that were just so psyched to like see each other face to face and actually have an opportunity to like talk and get to know each other. So that's where the Etsy Vintage Mastermind idea came from. I was like, what if we actually did this regularly, where people could sign up and we would meet? We first started meeting every other week, and now we meet every week, because I felt like every other week just was not enough. And if we could meet every day, I would meet every day, but that would maybe be too much. So we meet every other week on Zoom, and then we have a private Facebook community as well, where I'll post a couple of days a week or more than that. People can ask questions. I'll keep everybody updated on like Etsy news. I'll give advice. I have like tons of handouts and spreadsheets and goal worksheets and, all sorts of materials, at your fingertips, a whole resource library, YouTube videos, how-to videos, all sorts of stuff like that. So it's really just this one big community where, it's all women. We all get together. We all know that, if anybody has a question, they can just ask it in the community, and everyone will jump in and give advice. And it's very supportive. It's a very, a rising tide lifts all boats type of thing, where people share like their wins. They share, customer issues that maybe went wrong. So it's a really, really nice community where we can all kind of learn as a group. And I feel like learning in that group environment, you just learn so much faster than you would on your own, because, I've been coaching people for like, it's been over 2 years, right? It's been about 3 years, almost 2.5. I don't even know how long it's been. It feels like I just started, but it's been a while. But like all this knowledge that I've like amassed from just like working with other sellers, I say like, something may have happened to you that maybe hasn't happened to me yet, but I'm learning through your experience by, I'm helping you out with the problem. And then I can then, if it comes up with somebody else, I can help them too. So
That
yeah.
sounds like an amazing way for people to learn more about how to be successful on Etsy with their shops. And also, sometimes I think that we feel isolated. Just, being sellers. A lot of us tend to be somewhat introverted anyway, where
Right.
we like being home with our stuff and learning about that and being creative. And so I think it's a really great opportunity to get together and share our love of vintage.
Yeah. And I think too, like just getting people on the calls and speaking, it just gives them more confidence as well. Like a lot of these people, if you're just, because a lot of us are, I'm kind of an introvert extrovert. I don't know what I am, but I really do like my alone time, but I also really like to be around people. But it really, it holds people accountable too, because they know that I'm going to be posting, we've got listing challenges every month as well. So they know that I'm not like on people, I kind of am, but they know that they're going to be held accountable for their shops. Right. So it's really motivating, I think too, because they see other people doing great things and they're like, okay, yep, I can do those great things too. So
yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so let's get into some fun stuff.
You're gonna ask me, I'm scared.
Okay, no, these are easy. These are
Okay.
something. Okay, so let's see. All right, first question is going to be about bolos. And if people don't know what a bolo is, be on the lookout for this item. So So what are some bolos? You can just, give a couple examples of some bolos that you are looking for when you're out sourcing.
Okay. So definitely anything dance, like pots. Those are awesome. You can usually get them for a pretty good price at the thrift stores, and it's a pretty good profit. I just love like dance cookware, the enamel, cookware or anything like that. I'm so into like the 80s, 90s right now. I know you said that 90s wasn't really vintage, but I think it is. I'm like obsessed with like any kind of like plastic hooks or like the Yafa brand stuff. Like I've been selling quite a bit of that plastic plates, like just any cool like primary color like 80s stuff. Which is sort of like not totally the vibe for my shop, but it kind of works, because I've got like a lot of New England, like I've got a lot of like coastal decor, but then I'm like kind of pulling in, I am a child of the 80s, so I sort of pull that stuff in too. And then I've got like some antique ginger jar type things. Ginger jars are a big one that I always try to source, which they're not terrible to pack up either. That's one thing that's like actually fairly easy to pack. What else do I look for? Anything coastal, like coastal and brass are like a great combination. So I'm always looking for brass. It's definitely harder to find now. You can find it a lot at the flea markets, but at the thrift stores, it's really hard to find. And if you find it there, it's pretty marked up. So anything small. And then again, like I mentioned, anything that I've already sold before, I'm like, it's just so easy, it's so easy to sell. So those are kind of my things. I don't know. There's my categories are just all over the place. So it's,
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah. No, I'm the same way too. And you taught me to source for brass because I honestly would have passed it by every time.
It's so easy. It's so easy, right?
Yep. And people see there doesn't seem to be too much brass ever. You can't saturate the market with brass. So I think that's really exciting. And I mean, I tend to be able to thrift to source it. I never see it. I rarely see it in the thrift store, but I will see it in the antique shops. And people don't charge very much for it around here because it's just not popular. But and I remember, I think I thought to pass it by because I remember it being all over our house when I was a kid.
Right. Oh, that's probably why you're probably sick of it. That's how my mother is with like mid-century. She doesn't like it because that's like what she grew up with,
Yeah.
Maybe that's me with like the floral couch that my parents have. Like I'm kind of like over it. Like the grand millennial thing. I like it, but I don't.
Yeah.
Like, I wouldn't decorate my house with it, but with like a giant floral couch, maybe I would. I don't know.
We live
All
with
right, what
that.
do you?
Well, yeah, we'll get it. So yeah, that's the other thing, like pastels, because of course everything was pastel.
Oh God, yeah.
80s. Oh my gosh. So yeah, I'm kind of over pastels, but I know that they're having like a moment. They're coming back.
Totally. Everything's having a moment though. That's the thing with vintage. Like everything's in style right now.
Yeah.
That's what I think. Everything's in style. Like you kind of can't go wrong.
Yeah, that's really fun. That's a really fun thing about it.
Which is great. Yeah.
Okay,
so what about you?
A bolo for me is colored glass, any kind of colored glass. So I do try to use as much reusable packing as I possibly can. And I do, but you have to have bubble. You pretty much have to.
I know. Well, you could use that, the green wrap, like
That's true. Or I reuse bubble wrap. So I do that. And then you can also pack with cardboard, around it.
I use tons of cardboard. Yeah.
Box in a box. Yeah. You could do it that way. So but particularly lately Blanco glass has been my bolo.
I never find that. And maybe I just don't know what I'm looking for.
Yeah. But it looks a lot. Well, there are distinct tells for Blanco, but yeah, unless it has the tag on it, it can be really easy to miss.
Yeah.
So I've been learning a lot more about colored glass, and interestingly, I live really close to West Virginia. We have a really great West Virginia glass store nearby, like within 30 minutes of our house, and so they have a lot of Blanco, and there are a lot of other glass manufacturers that come from West Virginia. And I asked about this. They're apparently the raw materials to make glass are readily available in West Virginia. And that's why West Virginia had so many glass makers. See, and I was like,
that's so interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah.
So now when I think about it, I'm like, oh, so many glass makers there. A lot of them are out of business now, but but Blanco is still in business. And yeah, so Blanco, and then they've changed through the eras too, but you can look online. Actually on their website they have old catalogs, so you can look through the old catalogs and see the styles that they made, and identify, so it helps you to be able to identify some of the Blanco pieces. So anyway, so color glass, especially Blanco is one of my bolos right now. And then, oh, let's see, I have to pick one more bolo. Oh, art. Yeah, and shipping art is makes me really nervous.
Right. Well, depending,
Yeah,
small oil paintings I can deal with, but
yeah, but some of it is really big, and the glass and stuff like that. So but if you're afraid of shipping art that's framed like that, get canvas art, and pretty much any style goes too. That's the other thing. Right. I mean, people like to collect small pieces of art and then hang them together, or if you have a small space, you have small art, and also statement art pieces. And it doesn't matter if it's abstract or traditional or whatever. The art, I would say art's a big bolo right now.
Definitely. Yeah.
All right, cool. So, okay. So the next question is, if you had a nickel for every blank you saw in the thrift store, what would it be? What would the thing that you see everywhere and you just wish you had a nickel for it?
Does it have to be vintage?
No, it doesn't have to be vintage.
Okay. I mean, the thing that's like driving me up the wall is like the tumbler section at the thrift store.
I was gonna say the tumblers.
Were you gonna say that? It like sickens me to see how many tumblers and like water bottles are like just going. I mean, I just feel like that industry, like we don't need any more. Nobody needs to sell tumblers with words on them anymore. Like we are done. Do not stop Etsy. Everybody on Etsy, stop selling that crap. Nobody wants it. It's gonna end up at the thrift store. So it's such a waste. But for people who need that stuff, I mean, there's so much. I mean, if we get into the thrift store, I mean, there's just, you can buy literally everything that you need at the thrift store. Like, so I encourage everybody who's listening, which I'm sure you already do this because you're listening to a vintage podcast, but if you need something, any kind of household item, please go to the thrift store and look for it before. You can get knife, you can get cutlery, you can get cups, plates, like bowls, like literally anything, pots and pans. My husband gave me an egg, like for Christmas, he got me a pan, like a little egg pan from the thrift store because he wanted it, but he makes my eggs in it, because we needed that size. So anyway, but yeah, I would say like the tumblers are just, I've just absolutely had it with seeing tumblers at the thrift store.
Well, along those lines, and the egg thing is that the appliance for one function, like the crepe maker or the quesadilla maker or the whatever, like they are everywhere at the thrift store too, because people get them as gifts, and then you don't want like 15,000 appliances sitting around in your house. You don't have room for that, so you end up donating it, and that's what. So so that's one. But I was definitely going to say tumblers. But okay, if I had a nickel for every piece of false graph that I saw
oh my god, yes. Wait, don't even knock it though, because I sometimes sell those butter dishes because they like totally, by the way, butter dishes are like a big seller for me too. That's a good one.
Okay, that's a good bolo. Yeah, any of the companion pieces like the gravy boats or the stuff like that for a false graph. Yeah, that's stuff goes for you. But I mean, it is everywhere right now. So that's a big one for me. So all right, we'll have to do more of this later, but let's see. Oh, and then one more, the other thing I was going to say is, do you have any great stories about a great find? Like I can think of a few.
Yeah, I mean, I have like my best story, which is I found a pair of Karl Aubach bookends. He's an Austrian sculpturist. I found a pair of his bookends like strewn about a shelf in Salvation Army. I was just like running in there. This is back when I was working and I wasn't supposed to be there. I had gone to the gym early in the morning and I'm like, I'm just going to pop into Salvation Army right before I, hop in the car to go home, because it opened up, like it was like 9 o'clock or something. So I popped in there and I found this pair, and I didn't know who Karl Albach was back then. I had no idea who he was. So I found them and I could see kind of like a signature on the bottom, but I couldn't read them with my naked eye. I found those, and I also found a pair of Coke and Lowy mid-century brass task lamps, which are now upstairs and next to on either side of my couch, and I love them so much. So I've got those and the bookends in one trip. I think the bookends were, I don't even want to tell you how much they were, because they were $6 total. And the lamps were, I think they were $6 each. So that's thousands of dollars worth of, finds right there. So anyway, I went home, I researched the bookends and found out more about them. And I was just like, totally blown away. I was like, what are these doing in New Hampshire on a bookshelf in Salvation Army? Somebody definitely made a mistake. So those are probably my favorite and probably my best find. And I won't sell them. Those are like part of my personal collection. I almost did sell them because I had people reach out when I posted them on Instagram. But then I'm like, no, I want to keep some goods, because I really sell everything. Like there isn't much that I don't sell. I have a couple things, but like I'd sell them if I really wanted to. But those are definitely like part of my like permanent personal collection, because everyone deserves to have something really nice in their home too. So
yeah, I agree.
So that's mine. Yeah.
Long-winded story. When you have like a last minute stop and you're like, oh, I'm just gonna poke it.
That's when you find the stuff though. It's like when you're not looking for it. And I mean, but that's the thing, like back then I was going to the thrift store like every day. Like it was kind of therapy for me back then when I was really working full time and I wasn't super happy with what I was doing. I was going a lot. So that was a lucky stumble though.
Yeah.
A lucky stumble. Anyway, what about you?
I'm so glad you kept them.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess I have a couple of good stories, but the one I'll tell today is one of my favorites, because I don't usually look for I don't do toys, really sell toys too much. I don't have enough knowledge about them. And to me, that's a whole, I think toys are amazing, but it's a whole nother like genre of stuff to figure out. And there are people that have so much knowledge about toys, but every once in a while I get lucky, and I see something that I recognize. So it was actually this past summer, we were out at yard selling. They have this thing called the mile-long yard sale once a year, and they do it.
So fun. I'm like so jealous of that.
So you get your like little wagon and you walk from street to street, and there are like a million people out. So I walk up to this house and they're having an estate sale. So it must have been their mother's house or something, because it was filled with Ray Dunn. They had shelves of like Ray Dunn.
That's another one where I could not.
Now we're starting to see Ray Dunn everywhere.
Another one where I'm like, if I had a nickel for every freaking Ray Dunn mug, which I cannot stand. Just get that out of the way.
Yeah, okay. So they had tons and tons of Ray Dunn, and bins of stuffed rabbits. So she had like bunny rabbit signs and bunny rabbit collectibles, all these collectible like ceramic thing, and then she had like a couple of toy boxes filled with bunnies. And so there was this one chest that was really kind of old, and I thought, it just kind of caught my eye. So I went over to the chest and I like opened the lid, look, I was kind of looking at the chest itself, and it was filled with stuffed bunnies. So I looked down, and sometimes I get bunnies or stuffed animals for my dogs.
I was just thinking, I'm like, I hope you didn't give whatever it is to your dog.
Right. Okay. And if they're like 50 cents or $1 or whatever, I'm always thrifting for stuffed animals for the dogs, because they'll tear them up and then I can just, whatever. And, but I try not to take the really good ones. I leave those for the kids, because I always feel bad. I'm like, I can't take like something that a kid would really love. But I look down and there's this like leg sticking out of all the other bunnies, and it was like kind of dirty, and just there was just something about it that looked different to me.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that like I love about being educated, because the more educated you are and the more that you know about vintage stuff, like you can just get that little tiny glimpse of something, and in your gut that it might be special. Yeah. So I pulled it out of the bin, and it had it was filthy. It was a filthy little bunny, but it had a piece of paper taped around its leg, and it said Stife rabbit, 1950s question mark.
Wow.
And then it said something else like the lady's name that had owned it. So I guess she must have, and I love it when people do this, when they label their stuff. I don't know if you ever come
That's
across
the
that.
best. Yeah.
My grandparents used to do that. They would label, like, if it was a gift, like a piece of pottery was a gift, they would like write on the bottom or put a piece of tape on the bottom about like when they got it. And so she must have gotten this rabbit and been like, pretty interested in it. And so she wrote like a little note and taped it around its leg. And it was, even the note was really old. And so I looked at it, and Stife, the one thing that they do that makes them identifiable is that they have a button in the ear of whatever animal it is that they made. And the button has their name on it. And I looked, and it had the button and everything. And I was like, no way, I can't believe that there's like a Stife rabbit with all these, whatever, like Boyd's bear rabbits. And so I thought real quick, I was like, okay, I don't want her to think that this is a special rabbit. This is terrible.
Did you buy like a bunch of them? Did you buy?
Else, and I was like, I had like two, things.
Yeah.
And I'm like, how much do you want for this, stuffed bunny? And she was like, oh, I'll take $2 for both. And I was like, great. And I'm like, handed her my money, and I ran.
Oh my God. So wait, how much is that bunny? How much is it worth? Did you sell it?
I haven't sold him. I haven't sold him yet. He's listed. I did list him though for about $120. Yeah, I mean, he's not worth thousands. He would be worth more if he was in better, condition.
Did you get him cleaned? Like, did you get him professionally cleaned or anything?
I didn't. I did not do that. So I don't know. That's a good question though. One of the things I do want to talk about on the podcast is to talk about how to professionally like restore and clean things, and when you should and when you shouldn't. And so again, I don't know a huge amount about stuffed animals. So I don't know, like if it was a coat, I would have gotten it cleaned. Right. I would have cleaned it.
Well, yeah, I know this Stife is, I'm sure there's like communities out there where you could learn like how to clean them, because I feel like that's such a big thing.
Good point.
People really like, that's a big collector's item for people. So like, I wonder if it would be worth it.
Polyester stuffed animals, you just throw them in the wash and you wash them and they're clean. But he's definitely not stuffed. I think he's horsehair stuffed or something like that.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So he's an older one. So I didn't want to like waterlog him or mess him up or anything.
No.
But yeah, so I think just, and I mean, yeah, he was worth a couple bucks, for a dollar, pay $1 for him. But the exciting thing was just finding that like needle in a haystack. I think finding that one cool thing out of all the, stuffed rabbits and Ray Dunn. And I ran out of there. I was like, taking my bunny and running.
Awesome. I know yard sales, I feel like, are one of the best places to get stuff, because some people they don't care, or they just don't know what they have. So it's so great.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait till the season starts up again.
I know. I'm excited, but I'm nervous because I still have so much stuff I want to list before that. And I don't want to bring too much new stuff in here until I get a lot of it offloaded, because it's easy for it to, it's just, there are yard sales. There's just so many yard sales. It's like every weekend, all the time, flea markets. And it's just easy to get caught up in doing and buying a lot. So.
Yeah. I agree. Listing challenges. Time for listing
challenges. Yeah. Come join my listing challenges. I do one every quarter too, a bigger one. It's a 3-week long one and a separate group. So look out for those too.
Okay. So let's tell people, how can they sign up for your listing challenge or for the Etsy Mastermind group?
Okay, so I have a website. I have a brand new website that just launched. It's Phineas Street Vintage.com. Phineas Street Vintage, PHINEAS, and I'm sure this will be in the show notes. PhineasStreetVintage.com, and then PhineasStreet.com/mastermind if you want to check out the mastermind group, and just feel free to reach out to me with any questions. I also coach sellers one-on-one. I have a couple other offerings, like I do like an SEO tune-up program. I have some longer term students where I work with them for like 6 weeks at a time or 90 days at a time. So those are also options. So I have a bunch of different options on my website. You can check it out. And then I also offer a free weekly seller roundup newsletter. It goes out every Friday, and it's jam-packed with advice and news. And it's mostly related to Etsy and selling, and I add some personal stuff in there, but there's a lot of tips and tricks in there. So I would definitely recommend
It
if you're
is
a Etsy seller.
amazing. Your newsletter is
So
amazing.
I put a
Yes.
lot of time into it, but
Yeah, I can
I really
absolutely tell.
love writing. I love writing. So yeah, so definitely sign up for that because that's free. So I put a ton of free information in there. So it's super helpful for both new and experienced sellers. And the masterminds for new and experienced sellers too. So if you've been on for a while, on the platform for a while, I mean, there's always new stuff to learn. Um, and also just having that, just the community aspect and being motivated and being held accountable. It's so worth being, part of a community like that with somebody who's kind of leading the way. Um, it's just so worth it. So yeah, so my website has everything. And then I'm also on Instagram. I have 2 Instagram accounts, Phineas Street Vintage and Phineas Street School. So you can also follow me there for live updates as well.
Okay, great. And when do you know when the next listing challenge is going to be?
Yes. So I'm doing them the first month of every quarter. So what would that be? April? Yeah. So we just did one in January. We did one on October, January, and then it'll be the beginning of April. So the listing challenge, it'll be like a week. It's basically like a month-long thing. And the first week will be kind of like education, figuring out kind of like breaking down what your listing process is. Like, do you have any blockers? Like, what are you taking? Like, looking into your process, seeing like, where do you take the most time? Are you spending too much time researching, photographing, that kind of stuff? We'll kind of get into those mechanics. And then for 3 weeks, we'll list. We basically set goals and we list, and there's real prizes. Like you can win one-on-ones with me. Sometimes I'll send out like eco-friendly shipping supplies to the winners. So it's really just a fun way to motivate yourself to actually list the items that you have. Yeah, so that'll be April. April will be the next one.
Okay,
So
awesome.
I have a wait list for that on my website. So just check, you can sign up for the wait list, and I'll make sure you're the first one to know to sign up for it.
Perfect. Perfect.
Yep.
Perfect. Perfect.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for being our
Yes.
first guest on the
Oh
Vintage
my God.
Aquarium.
I'm so psyched for you. And I'm so excited to see where this podcast evolves. And I'm so excited to learn. And I hope
Thank
maybe
you.
you'll have me on again.
Yeah,
Maybe. I don't
for
know.
sure. For sure. This was really fun. And I will go
Awesome.
ahead and make sure that I put the links for everything in the show notes. So that way you can reach Phineas Street Vintage and Phineas Street School, and also follow the Vintage Aquarium on Instagram. We're putting together a newsletter so that you can follow the show and see what's coming up next. And but right now, Instagram is a really great way to follow the show as well. So
Yay.
all right. Well, we will see you again soon.
Thanks, Kate. Bye, everybody.